Allison, good afternoon. It is back to school week here in Florida for about a dozen or so counties, mostly smaller counties in the state. I'm in Duval right now in Jacksonville. They're opening on August 20th with plenty of precautions, a lot more, in fact, than we've seen in some of the other areas we visited so far. That includes requirements for everybody, staff and students, to wear a mask pretty much at all times. Buses, common areas, and classrooms. There are a few exceptions to that, namely band, recess, and PE. They are also providing masks and face shields to everybody pre-K through second grade. Then for third to fifth graders, they are installing desk shields around their desks for when the children, they understand, want to take off their mask for a breath. They'll be able to have that added layer of protection. That's what's going on here. Elsewhere, we've seen policies, Allison, where the masks are optional and parents and teachers and students are coming in. The teachers primarily wearing masks, but not all parents and students are. That's unnerved some of the folks that we've talked to. We know for a fact that the Superintendent Association here in Florida, the president of that group, has written a letter to the Department of Education asking for two things to happen. One, rapid response testing within these school communities. But secondly, uniform policies, because what you have right now in Florida essentially is a hodgepodge of rules, whether it's masks or what would actually trigger quarantines and notification of students and communities when it comes to positive COVID-19 tests. Really important questions that they want narrowed down here, as this debate is just now heating up with schools coming back, students coming back online, and COVID not going away. That is the very latest here in Jacksonville. Sam Brock, NBC News.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.